Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our discussion today on critical race theory. And I'll start with the introductions. I know there are other people who are still coming on, but they won't miss too much if I start now. First, I'd like to thank Susan Adams and the Citizens Climate Lobby for letting us use their Zoom line so that so many people could attend. We had over 200 people register, and hopefully they'll be able to attend today. My name is Pam Johnson, and I am the president of the board for the Unitarian Universalist Church of the Brazos Valley, or Brazos UU for short, and co-chair along with Wayne Sadbury, who's the curator of the Brazos Valley African American Museum for the Confronting Our Racism group, or CORG. CORG is a coalition of community organizations in the Bryan College Station area and includes members of the Brazos UU, the Brazos Valley African American Museum, and the Bryan College Station Black Lives Matter group. The CORE is sponsoring this forum on critical race theory today. Naturally, a discussion about racism can be very divisive, but I think you will all agree that such discussions are very important. CORG's goal is to start conversations and to educate ourselves about systemic racism and the ways racism impacts individuals and our communities. Besides today's program, the CORG hopes to provide additional programs in the future to continue this conversation. For more information about the CORG, you can go to brazos-uu.org or email admin, that's ADMIN, at Brazos, BRAZOS-UU.org with your questions. Also, this presentation is being recorded, and we will send links to everyone who signed up for this program and to others who asked ahead. And I need to thank John Faber for his tech support for making this presentation possible. Much is said about critical race theorem, but what does it really mean? It is a term that is being thrown around in a negative way. But what exactly is critical race theory? Shouldn't we be allowed to be inquisitive about it and ask questions? Today, we hope these questions will be answered. But first, let me tell you about how we have set up this program. Because we have so many participants, we have muted everyone, so no one inadvertently interrupts the speakers. I am sorry that you will not be able to speak directly to the presenters, but you can send your questions anytime during the presentation through chat. So just go to the chat button, the chat icon, and send your questions. Allison Faber, the Brazos UU Director of Outreach, will be helping us sift through the questions so that Crystal Sproul-Carter and I can ask as many as possible. Again, the topics we are discussing today may trigger many different emotions, so we ask that your communications remain respectful to the speakers and everyone else here, are communicated well, and show curiosity about the subject. I hope you can have questions from both sides of the issue so that this discussion is just not one-sided. So we really need to hear from everyone here, so be sure to send your questions, but be nice. If you submit a question that we deem inappropriate, such as insulting someone or using inappropriate language, you will be given a warning. If this happens again, you will be removed from the forum, unfortunately. So what better way to learn and have your questions answered than from two experts in the field? Professor Troy Harden is a new Texas A&M faculty member in the Department of Sociology. He is director of the Race and Ethnic Studies Institute, or RESI, at TMU. Professor Harden has served in leadership roles with multiple institutions on issues of race, gender, and poverty, including the City of Chicago's Department of Family Support Services, the Latino Policy Forum, Chicago Public Schools, Fathers, Families, and Healthy Communications, and just to name a few. But he is also board president of the Chicago Torture Justice Center, which provides mental health and community services for survivors of police torture by Chicago Police Commander John Burge and others impacted by state-sponsored violence. He received an Outstanding Educator Award from Congressman Danny K. Davis in 2017, is a graduate of Loyola University Master of Social Work program in Chicago, and received his doctorate from DePaul University School of Education. Welcome, Professor Harden. Professor Joe Feagin is also well known for his research in systemic racism and social justice. Professor Feagin is Distinguished Professor and LSE McFadden Professor in Sociology at Texas A&M University. He has done much internationally recognized research on U.S. racism, sexism, and political economy issues. He has written many scholarly books and articles in his social science areas. Among his most recent books are Rethinking Diversity Frameworks in Higher Education, The White Racial Frame, and Revealing Systemic British Racism. So racism doesn't just occur in the United States. He is a recipient of the 2013 American Association for Affirmative Action's Arthur Fletcher Lifetime Achievement Award and 3 American Sociological Association Awards, W.E.B. Du Bois Career of Distinguished Scholarship Award, the Cox Johnson Fraser Award, and the Public Understanding of Sociology Award. He was also the 1999-2000 president of the American Sociological Association. So welcome, Professor Feagin. And now I'd like to introduce Pastor Kaya Hartwood, our new minister at the Brazos UU, to say a few words.
Please appropriate a posture of prayer or meditation. Spirit of life and love and truth and justice, dear holy God of many names, I call upon you to be with us today. Be a near presence so we can rest in you whenever we need. Remind us to turn toward one another too, so that we might help each other. Help us not to forget to tune in to the beauty of our world, the little joys and the beautiful ways people resist destruction and empire. May our cups be filled so we can taste the sweetness of life. Then when we turn again to the work of nurturing beloved community, may we live in the ways that remind people of love. With our words and our actions, may we be blessed in our studies, and may we know the fruits of our work are truly a blessing. Amen, and blessed be.
Thank you, Pastor Kaya. Well, we hear all types of sound bits about how we shouldn't teach critical race theory to our children in school. Dr. Feagin, what is critical race theory anyway?
Let me put up a screen of the points I want to make in response to that very good question. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Certainly the key question is, what is critical race theory? And there's a current joke going around scholars who do critical race theory that's something like this. If your school child is being taught critical race theory, you should be very delighted. She is in law school. And critical race theory precisely and specifically is a research perspective developed in our leading law schools, initially at Harvard, by law professors of color in the 1980s. They named it, and they developed the concept. They pioneered in researching white racist biases in our U.S. legal system, a system mostly made by elite whites, principally elite white men. Most teaching of critical race theory today is still in our law schools. So the joke is pretty accurate. I don't know anybody in high schools or elementary schools who's actually teaching critical race theory. That's a rather absurd myth. So who started these misinformed attacks on critical race theory? So far as I can tell, these politicized attacks by white conservatives originated in far-right think tanks like the Manhattan Institute in New York about a year ago. And then they spread with this mythological notion that critical race theory has been being taught in our public schools. To my knowledge, almost no white conservative activists that I've read with this set of myths shows knowledge of actual critical race theory. And clearly they haven't read the key law school journals and law journal articles that developed and are still developing critical race theory. So another question that comes up is, why is there this illiterate white framed attack on critical race theory? So far as I can tell, this well-funded, and it is very well-funded, white right-wing attack is really about stopping all accurate research and teaching about the white racist foundations, history, and current realities, the realities of this country. That white racist reality is empirically demonstrable in thousands of research studies in many U.S. social science and other disciplines. To take one major historical example, 40% of the elite white men who crafted the U.S. Constitution, 22 out of 55, were or had been slaveholders. They made sure that the U.S. Constitution protected their slavery system in numerous constitutional provisions, some of which are fairly familiar, such as the 3/5 counting of an enslaved population. They made sure the Constitution protected their slavery system in numerous constitutional provisions. Somewhere around 8 provisions of the Constitution are in there to protect the slavery system. That slavery system, and later Jim Crow segregation, account for 80% of this country's history. That's an 8 and a 0. Most of our history has been slavery or the near slavery of Jim Crow segregation. This systemic racism very disproportionately benefits whites now over 20 generations. And that very long history of racial oppression helps explain why our systemic racism is so hard to change today. And it also helps explain this illiterate white framed attack, mythologizing critical race theory. So I'll stop there and let Troy chime into this discussion.
Hey, thanks, Joe. And thanks, Pam, and for the committee and for all the work that you all are doing. Just following up on Joe, I think Joe laid it out pretty well what the issue here is. What we're dealing with in many ways is the continued and persistent backlash and response, often that what we can argue some more conservative groups or whites in our society have done when faced with issues of equity building and the opportunity to grow as a country. And I think, Joe alluded to things like the Manhattan Institute and other spaces that have pushed this along. But I think it really hit the national landscape when in 2020, Trump issued an executive order really excluding any federal contract that dealt with diversity and inclusion training. And he labeled, a lot of these concepts as divisive and race and sex scapegoating, And so in other words, when people showed up at a training and they were taught or introduced to concepts of racism, and a lot of times many of us have been in trainings and or opportunities or education environments where there's been different debates about, all men are sexist or benefit in terms of privilege from sexism. Whites benefit from or carry privilege associated with racism. That basically these things are triggering, right? And so what Trump in his order basically suggested that we should do away with any of that language, that anytime that level of language comes into play, it's a problem, which I think what you see in the seeds of like the legislation here in Texas, that doesn't actually mention critical race theory. It does mention this reference to language and or ideas that target one particular group without presenting, another side of the story in an equal way, which is problematic. And I'll talk about that in a second. But what this is simply saying is that in talking about things like racism and the history of racism here in this country, and also saying that many whites have benefited from that, it ultimately triggers folks who are in the room. And by triggering and making people uncomfortable, it's wrong, right? That is the premise of much of the argument that we see out here. And so in this sense, I think it's important to unpack and begin to understand, first, what is CRT, right? And to Joe's point, I don't know any teachers who teach CRT in the K through 12 environment, haven't met too many who've taught it in four-year institutions, and mostly encounter it in graduate programs and or graduate literature. So it's an interesting concept. But what some on the right have done is target different language that comes up in CRT, like, for example, the language of intersectionality, to say that must mean they're teaching CRT. And so maybe it'd be helpful to at least understand what something like intersectionality and or what the key concepts of CRT actually offer. I think one thing first is to think about and consider the fact that CRT is not the problem here, right? It is not the problem here. The real problem are the conditions that were created that cause a need for a response such as CRT, right? And so what we're talking about is the 400 years of oppression, of discrimination against people of color here in this country, even targeting women in this country, targeting other groups that haven't been a part of the dominant discourse. That's the condition, right? So CRT becomes a theoretical and academic and critical legal studies response to that, saying, why is it that we have consistently seen this these persistent issues come up, even with the end of slavery, even with the ending of so-called Jim Crow laws. And I just want to show one picture that I think, for me, demonstrates this issue in a big way. And I'll just pull it up here for you all to see real quickly. I don't have a bunch of pretty slides, but I think this is here. So this, some of you may recall this iconic picture, and it is. But you may be more familiar with the painting that actually depicts this. This is Ruby Bridges in 1960, who was being escorted to school by armed officers in order to safely arrive at school. And here's the kicker with this, right? And to why we have to ask critical questions in our society. Brown versus Board of Education that actually or basically ended segregation as we know it happened in 1954. 6 years later, after the law by the Supreme Court justice was addressed, she still needed armed escorts to get to school. And so we have to ask, why is that, right? And so CRT and Derek Bell and scholars like that ask that question, why is that? Why is it that after something changes that really transform our society in a good way, we still have this history of racial disparity and discrimination in many of our institutions, right? Particularly in our institutions such as education, housing, our criminal justice system, healthcare, et cetera. What's going on? And the response is that there are certain things that we see that are systemic in nature, right? That we have to go back and explore, even our Constitution, even the people who created the Constitution and their motives in really unpacking why things are the way they are. And in that way, we are able to interrogate how laws that seemingly are neutral end up, or so-called colorblind, end up harming people of color. We have to include the voices of those people in examining the impact of this history, as well as those who are leaders in their respective fields and unpacking that. We have to hear their voices. And so this then gives an opportunity to really understand these issues in a very real way. So I think maybe I'll stop here and continue to open up for conversation. But I think, again, I'll go back to what Joe said. I don't see this happening or being taught in K through 12, we do know that there is a need to center history and the importance of truth, in our education environment. And so perhaps that is what's under attack here.
Okay, I got a question from the audience, from Uncle Matt. We heard earlier that racism might happen in England too, but that was my joke. I said there is racism in England also, and I think that might have been misinterpreted. But there is racism in every country. But racist views are easily studied and are actually less prevalent in white predominant countries today. That's what Uncle Matt said. So isn't it a biased and racist view to suggest racism is inherently and uniquely American or white? Would either of you like to answer that question?
I think the best way to answer that question is, before we look at other racisms beyond the U.S., we need to fully understand that 80% of U.S. history, that's 16 generations of U.S. history where whites in this country dramatically increase the resources for their families and pass them along generation after generation. and kept in place slavery and Jim Crow, and now informal racial discrimination to keep Black families and other families of color from doing the same thing. 80%, economic studies show 80% of a family's wealth today is inherited over previous generations. And Black Americans have only had the most recent 1 or 2 generations to generate significant resources for their families. We need to I think we Americans need to focus on this country's racism. And whites invented it. Whites invented the term white, black, red, yellow, all of that color coding was invented by elite whites, mostly men. We have to face that fact first.
Yeah, and I'll just add one piece. I don't have problems with people studying how race how race and racism show up in different countries. I do think we don't understand enough about how it's played out in its many facets here in this country. I think we're still struggling to teach accurate history. We're still struggling to teach facts in our classrooms, particularly in the K through 12 environment, in many places throughout the South and in many places even in the North. Right, we're just learning key aspects of history. I've seen even over the last few years, some scholars have contributed new works, examining just different aspects of different laws that have happened over the last 400 years. So because of that, we could just spend all our time just unpacking how racism was played out in the U.S. And that would be enough. But I think one of the underlying issues that does reflect some Western thought, is the idea of race. Race and what Bell and Delgado and others offer is a social construction, right? And it's not biologically determined, right? And that was what many of mostly white men, philosophers, so-called scientists 500-600 years ago wanted to determine or wanted to say is that race somehow was a biological construct that ultimately justified, the oppression of certain groups, because of phenotype, because of skin color. And one of the key pieces is first dismantling that, right? The biological impetus for race, and really begin the process to understand if it is a social construction, then, what was the motivation and how is it played out to harm? And what is the continued justification for the disparity and creating disparities in the way that they play?
Hello, everyone. Hello. I appreciate the invitation to serve in this capacity, to present questions in this forum, in this public forum, along with Pam. I am Crystal Spruill Carter. I currently serve as a communication specialist in the Office for Diversity. And some of you may also know me as a former director of the Brazos Valley African American Museum. So the first question that I have to present is to both of our presenters, and it relates to the modern criminal legal system. In what ways does critical race theory make explicit the racist roots of the modern criminal legal system? And particularly, how does critical race theory explain or help us understand the disproportionate, unwanted, or unfair burden of the death penalty on Black citizens and any of its ties to lynching, Jim Crow, and slavery?
I'll take a first jump at that. I think because the first part of your question talked about and asked about, just how our criminal justice system really demonstrates the racial disparity piece. I think it's no secret that if we look across the country, we see that particularly Blacks and Latinos, are disproportionately impacted in the criminal justice system. And arguably, we can look at every point of intersection with criminal justice, from surveillance to arrest to court proceedings and prosecution to sentencing and ultimately incarceration and post-incarceration, to really see these disparities. But then the question is, how do they play themselves out? And one particular aspect that is worth considering is the idea of policing, right? And the nature of policing. So where did it come from? How did it start? And if we go back to the beginnings of policing here in this country, we could see how and trace its origins associated with white patty rollers, who were licensed to support the protection of whites in many areas, associated with both enslaved and free African Americans. And so, and by setting up both these informal and formal networks designed to, again, protect whiteness and the nature of whiteness, we can see how many Black folks, were impacted, during that particular time period. As time went on, many of these institutions began to formalize in communities, and particularly in urban centers, and was set up in very similar ways. Here in Texas, it's no different. We had something called the Texas Rangers, right, that operated in a certain way. And so we would begin to see these assumed practices of safety, or these mantras of safety and serve and protect, that would come out that would basically say everybody's worthy of service and protection. However, if we looked at the history, we would see how communities were harshly treated, often by police, right? That for years and decades, policing was mostly made up of whites, right? And then the continued legislation, legal proceedings, the narrative often led itself to actually protecting certain groups of people, mostly whites, from urban or even rural Blacks, Latinos, and others, right? And so in that sense, a study like COT would offer this opportunity to interrogate, this history and to see what current practices still exhibited, in this way to harm people of color. I'll stop there. Let Joe speak.
Yes, I agree with what Troy just said. And if you're looking for good resources on these issues of the bias in the incarceration system, one prominent critical race theorist is Michelle Alexander, a law professor who did a book called The New Jim Crow. And she applies that metaphor of the old Jim Crow system to the current extreme racial bias in our criminal justice system. So that book, The New Jim Crow, is a good one to pursue if you're resourcing and researching that question of systemic racism in our criminal justice system.
I'll add, because somebody asked about the death penalty, another book that I think is accessible and is a great read is Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy. And Stevenson's work has been specifically about the death penalty and the impact on and discriminatory practices associated with the death penalty on both adults and minors. And he's done some amazing work. And so it'll be a great read for folks around that, his equal justice initiative as well. And in Alabama, they developed the lynching memorial I forget the formal name of it, but in just really demonstrating that connection between past and historical lynching, right, to the modern day use of the criminal justice system to disenfranchise people of color, and showing that arc, I think is immensely critical. As a matter of fact, some of they mentioned earlier the torture justice center that I'm a part of. Many of the survivors actually took a trip down to the lynching memorial to really, understand that connection between policing, past lynching, the criminal justice system, et cetera, right? And so there's certainly a connection there.
And another very good resource is a relatively new book by a Latina sociologist, Nicole Gonzalez Van Cleve. It's called Crook County. She spent 15 years inside the Cook County criminal justice system, which I think is about our largest in this country. And it explains how everyday racism works in a white-controlled criminal justice system in Cook County, which is Chicago. Very good ethnographic study by Nicole Gonzalez Van Cleve.
Okay. We have a lot of questions about our educational system and the role of the school boards. Many questions about what can school boards do to make sure students are receiving a truthful and accurate historical perspective in their history books when the history books are not even honest. But closer to home, talking about schools, there's a very disturbing phenomenon I came across talking to professors of color at Texas A&M, and they said things such as they would never let their children go to a College Station school, and that parents of color will move to Bryan to avoid College Station schools. And some even said they would commute to work in the College Station area so that their children would go to schools in the suburbs of Houston and not College Station or Bryan schools. And so I'm wondering if Professor Harden, if you have ever heard of this, and why is it? Why are they not wanting their children to go to the public schools in College Station since they're rated so high? And also, what can the school boards do to do a better job at educating students on history?
Yeah, of course I can't answer without, I haven't done a research study on parents of color in College Station or Bryan, so I can't necessarily speak on that with certain authority, but I do know why and what happens for many parents who look at areas that are either or how they value education, what they consider. I think even looking at what might be considered a good school, right? And some of the things that parents look at, one, they look at the academic achievement of the students of color associated with whites at that particular school. So what does the history say at that particular school concerning everything from I don't even know if they have AP programs down here, advanced placement programs, college readiness versus other programs. So are those classes predominantly white in proportion to the rest of the school, or are they disproportionately one group or the other, right? In special education, is there one group that is proportionally fixed, in a way over the course of the years? When we look at disciplinary practices in that particular school, what do we see? Do we see a proportionate mix of children and young people who end up in with either behavioral marks or disciplinary infractions reflective of the school, or is it disproportionately Black or Latino or Asian, et cetera, in those particular environments? And if they see that there's a disproportionate number of students of color who end up in disciplinary processes, right? Or don't have the same academic levels, in terms of testing scores, things like that, as others, then it leads to some really clear questions, right? About what's happening at the school. Are there things at the school that are addressing this disparity, and how does that take place? And, the little I know, I've only been here a year, right? But the little I know about College Station and Bryan schools are that there are some disparities that take place, right? And it is an uphill battle often for parents of color to fight that. You definitely don't want to have your young people fight that alone, but there's also an uphill battle often for parents to fight that. And particularly when you have things like the recent legislation that doesn't want to teach accurate history, then folks want to make choices around schools that are reflective, that challenge their children, of course, but also are reflective of being a warm and welcoming place, that their history and their perspectives can be at least honored and valued, in a critical way. And so without that, you get this other piece that ends up happening. So the hope is that teachers, particularly newer teachers, aren't intimidated by the language of the state law, and will continue to teach accurate history in the state, as well as teach critical thinking to our children.
That's a very good question, Pam. I've been here 17 years at A&M, and I know personally of about a dozen Black faculty who left because of the hostile racial climate in Bryan College Station, including in College Station high schools. In sociology, we lost a top young criminologist because of the racist treatment of his son in a local high school. And beyond the high school, others have come and gone, or not come in the first place because of the hostile racial climate. And I think you finished up asking, what do we do about it, right? Decay begins at the top and change begins at the top. We need the senior education people in the public schools, especially in College Station, but Bryan College Station, first to educate themselves about the racist history of this town, this set of cities, this state, and this nation. So I think the kind of education we've been touching on, an anti-racist education, a clear, honest education on this country's deep systemic racism, has to begin with the top decision-making people in our public education system. And one place they can start is by listening to candid discussions by faculty, Black faculty, Latino faculty at A&M, Asian faculty, and their experiences with their children in the local public schools.
Sounds like an interesting study, Joe. Yeah, but I think Joe hit the hit. I've certainly heard some of those things myself. But also, he alluded to the fact that leadership, it starts with leadership, to really being able to again, not be intimidated and, look at the truth and ask critical questions of what may be happening in these environments. Historically, in an environment that people aren't necessarily a part of the dominant group, it's harder to ask those questions. It's harder to speak up about those things. So how do we create the space for that? And then when we hear things that aren't are new or uncomfortable, how do then we address and move on it in a critical way? And I think those are the questions that should be asked.
And again, you can see why the ex-president, Donald Trump, tried to ban these kinds of discussions, and why conservative state legislatures are trying to ban these discussions. If we don't have these discussions about how local, state, federal, national racism works, you can't solve it. You can't solve the problem unless you first confront it accurately.
Thank you. Thank you both for sharing your views on education in the Brazos Valley. And we have a question that discusses climate justice and environmental justice. And this particular question talks about, we all know that in March 2020, coronavirus gripped the United States, and we're living with the effects of coronavirus. And it has laid bare many of the structural inequalities in the United States. Much like this current crisis, the climate crisis also threatens the safety and stability of many of our most vulnerable residents. So what steps need to be taken to better address both economic and systemic racial injustices to advance environmental justice and climate justice? And this, we can hear from both speakers.
Rory, you want to start with that one?
It doesn't matter. I'll take a stab. One of the things that I was certainly in tune with coming down here, of course, Chicago, we don't have too many hurricanes. We don't have any hurricanes, right? And so our environmental issues are different, However, I've been paying attention to many of the issues around the environment and climate justice debate, over the years, and particularly where that shows up in communities of color and low-income communities. And certainly, if we look at some of the issues happening globally, we can see, and even in trends in migration patterns and other dynamics, we can see where climate is playing a role and is going to continue to play a significant role. And certainly in our region, it's a very serious issue. And certainly I witnessed, studied and watched, kind of what happened going back to Hurricane Katrina, and then more recently to Harvey here. And then, of course, what's happening around the freeze, right? And so we even did a panel back in April with our Hazard Reduction and Recovery Center at Texas A&M to really think of, start asking that question is, what is the impact on the current issues of climate and environment and or disaster and either low income and or communities of color. And you can see where those who struggle are most vulnerable, often show up in some of these areas. And so one of the things is a couple of things in response to that. One thing that we just saw, I think just came out recently, it might have been in the Houston Chronicle, it just talked about this disaster. You saw the most deaths by carbon monoxide that we've ever seen at one time, right? For example, now I need to verify that data, but that's what I heard recently. And that is what you could consider to be a direct result of what happened, with people, heating their homes, with in various ways that end up causing loss of life. One of the things too that we're involved in, we just received funding to look at how we might do preservation work in some of the freedom colonies, the historic Black freedom colonies in Texas, because of what happens associated with disaster, it disrupts family life, disrupts history. And so how do we help people maintain that? And so we'll be conducting trainings in certain communities around Texas to help people preserve their history, for example, right? And so that's, a response in many ways to what's happening both with the historical oppression, right? The disaster of racism, but also the disaster of climate, right? And how we might address. I'll stop there.
Yes, I think I would add to that, Crystal, certainly the first big step has to get more voices of people of color into the conversation about the environment, and especially in powerful decision-making positions. Until we get a diverse array of Americans that looks like America does today involved in those decision-making positions, our environmental actions and decisions and policies will also be systemically racist, almost without a doubt. And certainly one impressive thing that the new president has done is to appoint the first Native American as Secretary of the Interior, for example. Deb Hagin of the Laguna Pueblo Nation in New Mexico is the first Native American, I think, in a major cabinet position. And it now not only gives her some power, but also her voice, and the Native American voice is now up there in discussions of environmental decisions in this political administration. So I think the first step has to be to diversify the decision-making structure on the environment.
And I just add, and that's huge. You can't discount the power of that. We have a dominant narrative in this country that for years, and it started to lessen a little bit, but for years it was that climate, this climate issue isn't real, right? It's false, right? We had a narrative. We had thousands of scientific papers and studies really saying we're in crisis, right? And you had groups, political leaders, state leaders, right, federal leaders saying it doesn't exist, don't worry about it. And then now, of course, we had the hottest summer ever, right? Across the board, the warmest temperatures ever recorded. Something's, there's a lot of problems. So having diverse voices, and we can see when you have a strong dominant narrative like that, it's harder for people of diverse voices to speak up. It's harder for those who just are critical of that to speak up. And so the importance of inclusion here, right, is critical. And so I think Joe nailed it on the head, right? We have an opportunity at this point, and we just got to keep moving on it.
And I think an even more direct example is Mike Regan. Mike Regan is the new head of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, African American, was head of the Environmental Protection Agency, I think, in North Carolina. He's probably the first person of color to head up the EPA. I don't know that for sure. Almost certainly the first Black American to head up the EPA. But we do need more voices like his and Hallen's at Interior, right, in the discussion of environmental change and climate change.
Getting back to our education, one person asked this question, and they said that they think Black parents are more likely to support school choice. But are we sure that disparities in academic achievement are conduct and conduct are due to racist teachers and not absent or disengaged parents?
Can you try that one again, Pam? It sounds like there's two questions there.
Right. That Black parents are more likely to support school choice. That's what someone is saying. And is that true? And the question is, are the disparities in academic achievement that we had been talking about, are they due to racist teachers or absent or disengaged parents?
Joe, you want to run with that first?
Sure, go ahead. Troy, you want me to? Yeah, there's a long answer to that question and a short answer to that question. Racial inequality in this country, in every major area, is the result of 20 generations of racial discrimination, slavery, Jim Crow, contemporary discrimination in all major areas of this society, the economy, the educational system, the political system. So when you focus down on a narrow topic, like choice in schools today, to really understand inequality in our public school system, you can look at it up close, but you also need to look at that bigger societal history and box, if you want to put it that way, around these educational decisions. For example, I just did a book with Edna Chun called Who Killed Higher Education? And one of the key causes of the decline in many of our public colleges and universities, they've gotten more expensive. It takes big debt in many cases to go to them. Half the professors are being replaced by temporary faculty. All of these big changes stem from the systematic defunding over the last 40 years by conservative state legislatures have defunded our public colleges and universities. Now, what does that have to do with the question you just asked? Well, one solution to the problems of K through 12, public K through 12, is severely underfunded, especially in working class communities. Upper middle class communities, which are predominantly white in most cases, can provide a lot of extra financial support to beef up their public system. But our public schools have deteriorated in general over the last 50 or 60 years because of local declines in funding. And the funding often tracks along racial lines. When white kids were at Lamar High School in Houston, where I went, Lamar High only had white students when I was a high school student there. It was well funded. Our chemistry teacher placed people in winning chemistry competitions nationally every other year. My brother graduated from there 7 years after I did, went to Rice and just skimmed through his chemistry classes because the quality of education at Lamar High School was super well funded and excellent, a public high school in Houston. Over time, the high school has become more and more kids of color, and the funding for Houston public schools is not nearly at the level it was, adjusting for inflation, in my high school days there. So I think there are a lot of ways to address that question, right? One is aggressively, adequately funding every public school in this country, no matter what the racial composition of that school is. Over a generation, you'll begin to fix these inequality problems. If you just tweak around, well, can we have more charter schools? You can make some little changes, but the big change has to be at aggressively funding public education like it was in my day. We don't do that.
So the question was, I think, related to the kind of old trap around parenting versus the teachers, or the institution, right? So I usually like to start off that or answering that by saying accountability matters, right? That there is a misnomer that somehow when we begin to talk about systemic inequalities, somehow we aren't talking about things like accountability of the family or communities, et cetera. And it's usually quite the contrary. It's usually from these, families who have seen their children succeed or have succeeded themselves in many of these systems environments, take a look and see, okay, these other things have been happening, like Joe mentioned of the disparity associated with funding, right? And inequities associated with funding. When we begin to see things like discipline practices begin to operate a certain way, and when we unpack it from administration all the way down to teachers, we start seeing some of the racial tropes and racialized tropes that exist, that have existed for centuries, right? I just remember when Annette Ferguson wrote her seminal book, Bad Boys, just looking at how are the young African-American males showing up in detention more so than the white students, and really begin to trace and see over and over again the times when the teachers demonstrated either bias, assumptions that were erroneous, created harm within the classroom environment, microaggressions. We talk about that term a lot. I would say micro and mesoaggressions, administrative practices, all led up to an environment that ultimately discriminated and often pushed out these young people, right? And so those systems that really effectively address those issues have different results. But then it goes back to the funding challenges as well, because if they don't have the continued funding support and in an equitable manner, it leaves them vulnerable for other pressures, like what's happened in this past year with COVID, right? We can see the disparities begin to show up. They're already happening, but now they're even greater because of what's happening across education in our country.
Thank you. Thank you both. I am enjoying this conversation, and I appreciate the resources that are being shared. We have a question that has been asked among our audience. How do you engage with people that refuse to acknowledge that racism is real? Mm-hmm. And how do you move forward as a society? So that's one of our questions that we're posing, and we can present that to both of our presenters.
Well, that's a great question, and considering that there are people who still don't believe COVID-19 is real, I think we got if we can figure this one out, we can figure the other one out. Maybe, I don't know, but I think this is where again education continues to be important. Is to really look at data, right, both quantitative and qualitative, right. To see, what is there's a famous W.B. Du Bois quote. I'm going to butcher it probably here, but basically he says, we look at the data, to see, it reveals, it's not just looking at numbers. Ultimately, it's going to reveal a story there, right? It's going to reveal something for us. And then that's the point of inquiry. That's the point where we ask the question. And it's the same to be able to hear the narratives of folks, to really understand things. So I think that's where I just finished reading Annette Gordon-Reed's On Juneteenth that I recommend for folks as well. She's Harvard professor, but also Texas native. And this book actually won a Pulitzer as well. And it's a great little read, less than 200 pages, but really begins to understand that history associated with Juneteenth, but actually what happens she talks about, what happened for her growing up in a little town near Bryan, right? In terms of going to school and dealing with history, right? And facing, some of the dynamics and issues there, but also how we might engage each other around dealing with facts and dealing with the truth. And which I think that's the question, is how do we engage people and deal with the truth? I think it's to stay consistent and affirm, to find spaces where we collectively engage that. And then for those who aren't ready, we introduce new practices to be able to educate and inform, right?
There's certainly one answer to that question, Crystal, is having a lot more discussions like this in as many communities in this country as we can, as often as we can. I think a majority of the American people really do want to see us become a real multiracial democracy. Now, right now, they're not concentrated in my generation, at least the white part of it, right? They tend to be in the younger generations. But I think certainly education like this is a critical part of it. Now, you can't engage people who don't want to learn. You have to engage those who do want to learn. But I think education has a critical role to play in the answer to that question. And the best evidence for that is this huge pushback at stopping a critical education. I've sometimes joked that the people attacking critical race theory, what is their perspective? Mostly it's uncritical racism theory. They're operating out of an uncritical white racist framing of society that says we need to shut down this critical discussion of white racism, its history, and its current reality. There are not a lot of people of color who want to shut that discussion down. And it matters, I think, that critical race theory mainly has been developed by law professors and scholars of color. And almost the entire critical race theory pushback is by white, mostly male, conservative activists. Visualize that, and you can understand the big problem. They want to shut this education down on critical race theory and systemic racism. But I think most people of color and even the younger generation of whites are more open to opening that discussion up with an honest and accurate analysis of this country's racist history and racist present. Without that full discussion and some changes coming out of it, this country's probably doomed.
Well, that also gets into the education people are receiving. One of our participants said, most of our K through 12 education in the US is based around textbooks which represent our history from a white supremacist perspective. That means that publishers are collaborating in this inaccurate history. Publishers will say that their textbooks have to be adopted by school boards. So it seems to me to be sort of a vicious cycle. And this person was asking if you could comment about how to break this cycle between the publishers and the school boards and inaccurate history.
Well, certainly one big step is you've got to put people on the school board who look like the community. You know, what the US Congress is like 73% white. It doesn't look like America. Most everybody is college educated. It's an elite group. And school boards are the same way, with some good exceptions. But desegregating the school board by class, race, and gender is the first step, I think, in getting better books approved for the children that reflect the real America.
I'll just add, Joe, you might have froze. I think that point is very, very real. And I think one thing that I've seen that is resistant sometimes to that is I can't find the people, the right people, et cetera, which I think is usually a cop-out because they exist. And if you don't have the numbers per se, then how do you grow that? How do you mentor? How do you support? How do you put people in training, to get to the point of being ready, to be in those particular positions? Once you have things like the board that reflect the community, then it's important to continue the educational process, right? In terms of what are some of the best practices that different cities, counties, communities, are addressing across the country, associated with education and an education that has accurate history, which then goes back to the resources piece. How do you go about raising towards that? And I think some of these conversations are brand new in certain places. Some people just started talking about them after what happened with George Floyd last summer, right? For others, they've been doing it for years. And so I think there's a long body of history to learn from, and we don't have to repeat some of the mistakes of the past, but we may not have understood the sophistication associated with the pushback around different issues, and can address for the long term, in order to create a more equitable educational process.
It basically comes down to electing a diverse school board, a really diverse school board that represents the community. And state legislature and national legislature.
And I don't want to minimize that. In Chicago, from where many of us have been pushing for an elected school board for years, and they're just now at the point of that consideration. And I mean, I'm telling you, for years they were pushing that, and there was pushback from the dominant mayoral administration, for a long time, associated with that. And now it's finally getting ready to happen. And I've seen that in different places around the country. So it may be timing is important.
Thank you both. I have the next question. We're going to switch modes to the 1619 project. developed by Nicole Hannah Jones and the New York Times Magazine. And what exactly is the 1619 Project, and why do we hear that if we acknowledge it or follow it, it will ruin our country? And so wanted to both, and this is for both our speakers, what exactly is the 1619 Project, developed by Nicole Hannah Jones and the New York Times Magazine, and what are the sentiments around it?
Well, the 1619 Project, and by the way, I was a fact checker for a couple of points in their project, is a project developed by a diverse group of journalists who consulted numerous historians and other social scientists to try to do a discussion and presentation of the role of racism, and especially the beginning of it, the slavery system, and how it shapes this society over time, with a very significant input from scholars and journalists of color. The attack on it has mostly been from white men and white people. Surprise! Isn't that a surprise? Now, some historians have nitpicked it, and it's a historical discussion of the role of slavery and other racial oppression in our history. And they may have gotten a few facts wrong here or there, and maybe you can develop an alternative interpretation. But it's a really bold attempt to present to a general population of readers a lot of data and discussion that you can find in really first-rate historical books and analyses. And it hit a sore spot when Donald Trump and some of his right-wing advisors set up a 1776 commission with no historians on it to do a sanitized history of American society. And they threw it together in a short period of time, I think. Probably consulted some white supremacist groups to be sure they got that part right. But one top Yale historian the other day told me he thought it was like uneducated sixth graders had put this together. It was amazingly childish, the 1776 Commission. But the 1619 Commission was making an attempt to present to a large American audience what historians, all of us who read the good new historians, know about the actual history of this country. And a lot of that history has been covered up even before this attack on critical race theory. A lot of our history has been covered up. I give lectures where I give many examples. Francis Scott Key, for example. Do you know he was a slaveholder and wishes black people dead in the third stanza of the national anthem? And the black people he's wishing dead are the ones who fled to the British lines and joined the British military and fired back at the slaveholding Americans. There's just a lot of stuff about our history. Surely we can find a song by some non-slaveholding American as our national anthem. But I have a student, a grad student, and we've been trying to find a good history of Francis Scott Key, the way he viewed the world. He's amazingly understudied. Why? Because you start getting some of these truths about he and his family were slaveholders. Also, he hated the First Amendment when it applied to white abolitionists who were passing out pamphlets in DC. White abolitionists were passing out pamphlets against slavery. In addition to being a slaveholder, he was like a district attorney, I think, in DC, and he tried to prosecute 2 white abolitionists for passing out pamphlets against slavery. Now, isn't that a wonderful example for our children? How about if we try to find a national anthem, and we've got some good songs, right, that were written by much more democratic Americans. So what a lot of these historians have done is begin to uncover some of this unseemly, deep, disturbing, dark part of American history. And the 1619 Project, I think, was trying to present what we're beginning to understand about the history of systemic racism to a general audience.
Yeah, I don't have much to add there. Particularly that brief but important critical note around Francis Scott Key that I'm sure got folks like, really? But I think that's the important of really looking at the truth of history. I certainly I'm not going to say I'm ready to get rid of the Star Spangled Banner today, right? However, we should at least unpack that and interrogate that, right? And at least have the truth of that, which may even make the meaning of it, or the singing of it, or the even hearing it more powerful, right? I know certainly the singing of the national anthem for often for when you see an African American singing it, particularly in a place and a position that has been historically reserved for whites, is often a very powerful counter story, if you will, right? Just in that simple way. So I wonder how we can continue to support efforts like the 1619 Project to really engage in being able to meaning make, for ourselves and for our children. As Joe mentioned, we are in a truly multiracial society where we're trying to support the development of leadership that reflects that, and a level of equity that reflects that in our country. And we're not there yet. And one clear pathway to get there is to really look at the truth of our history and ask hard questions and formulate what it will be best for our individual selves as well as our collective selves. And I think we're at that precipice. We keep reaching it again and again in our country, and I think we're here again now. And so we are at a critical time to be able to do that. And again, the 1619 Project really pushes the envelope around that and gives us the opportunity to relook at assumptions of history. And again, we mentioned, CRT and other critical views of race. Francis Scott Key and other figures, we made assumptions. We made assumptions about who Thomas Jefferson and George Washington were, pre-knowing, their history as slave owners, right? And how does that change, our relationship to our founding fathers, and or even how policy and our Constitution was shaped, right? What is it that we need to be inclusive about at this critical point that we may have missed by denying the complexity of that history? I think we owe it to ourselves and we owe it to our children to be able to engage in that way.
And by the way, again, on resources, Nicole Hannah-Jones and some of the other people on the project have put it into a book. And the book is supposed to be released sometime in November of this year. I would encourage as many people, if you're really interested in these issues, is to get it and read it. They've added to it more sections with data, I think, footnotes, details. But if you want to know what the 1619 project is, you can get a book now that presents it to you pretty soon.
Well, here's a question that's a little bit more about current policies. Professor Harden and Professor Feagin, what are your positions, or what's your opinion on the current conversation of defunding the police? And do you advocate reduction, removal of law enforcement?
Great question. Well, as I mentioned, we have to be able to talk about history and particularly the history of policing in communities of color around the country and the impact of that on different communities. And we have to, as well, understand the relationship between policing and communities of color. A fundamental question that a lot of folks are asking around the country is, when we increase policing, does crime get better? Does crime go down, right? When we increase the amount of resources that we give policing around the country, do we see our communities get safer? And the unequivocal answer is no, right? Increase resources, increase policing, it's been shown that there's no effect that's shown that things get better. As a matter of fact, we can make the case, and Joe referenced Michelle Alexander earlier, that things get worse, right? We had a war on drugs that supposedly was to attack and address many of these issues associated with crime, and particularly drug trafficking in many of our communities, where we actually just saw an increase in the amount of people of color, particularly Black and brown men, going to prison for longer sentencing, for harsher sentencing, in ways that were also, again, illustrated our racial disparities that we historically see. And so when we hear, particularly after we've seen the killing of men and women, primarily Black, but also brown and even white in some cases, by police, often unarmed, we begin to see that there's a pattern that exists in many of our spaces that needs to be interrogated and addressed. And so the calls for defunding are really about reprioritizing. And some would say the need to refund communities as opposed to just defund, right? And so how do we really look at the roots of some of the issues associated with crime or assumptions associated with crime, or what leads to it in some of our communities, particularly around violence? How do we put resources in place that address that, and as well, redirect some of those resources in some real ways. And so some cities, I think, as a matter of fact, just this week in Minneapolis, St. Paul, they're seriously looking at revising their budget to address this. LA, Los Angeles, and Los Angeles County last year did a significant amount of restructuring of their funds and resources to go more towards social programs that would address and get at the root of crime. But here's where some of the CRT work comes back in, right? Because we could all agree that if we take resources to address some of the conditions of some of the social problems, that should lead to a lesser crime from folks as they begin to grow up, as they begin to get mental health services, more educational services, et cetera, right? But the assumption has been for decades, centuries even, that crime and being Black or brown are inherently linked, right? And so somehow or another, it's not going to take any other type of resources. It's actually just going to take locking people up because that's the justification for it, right? That's what history tells us again and again. Dominant culture will move to in terms of policy. Lock them up, throw away the key, and that's the solution. And so there's pushback from folks around dismantling the historic industry of policing and the criminal justice system in our country. And so now I think that's what people are asking for. It's like, hey, let's start paying attention to another way of addressing harm, in our society that hopefully can make our society into a better place, because policing just hasn't gotten us there. Does it mean that we never need any safety or anything like that? I don't know. But I do know we have to ask some critical questions about the nature of it.
Yeah, there's really a big discussion around that defunding issue. And I think the defunding issue has become a red herring to take our focus off the real set of problems. The problems are the way we do policing in this country. Some of that may need more funding, and some of that may need less funding. For example, this is the premier so-called democracy on the planet, right? We're supposed to have advanced criminal justice and other kinds of legal systems. But today, in most cities, if somebody's in crisis, acting crazy, some person, we don't send mental health teams, we send well-armed police officers to deal with people in crisis. And that often comes down bad, right? The Washington Post yesterday, the editorial board of the Washington Post yesterday had a big editorial on it's been keeping a database of police killings. Police have killed 6,400 Americans since 2014. And they've killed 943 Americans in this year so far. And a lot of those are people in crisis. We should have mental health teams funded to deal with them. We mostly do not. We send police officers who are not trained to deal with mental health issues. Many of them know that. They don't want to be there. So I think we need to get off this funding defunding and talk about what we need to fund, right? How do you reduce police killings? Well, send mental health teams. Well, that requires funding mental health teams. And often police function other ways to deal with homeless people. So in some ways, we need to refund the police and channel the money to some of these other things to take these burdens off police officers who really aren't trained to deal with them. And the Post editorial says only 20% of our police officers have body cameras. Only 1 in 5 police officers has a body camera. Well, let's fund some body camera programs. So I think the issues are what we're doing with policing, how we can do it better. Certainly I've done some racial training for police departments. We need much better anti-racist training for police departments and police officers. I think that's where I would put this police discussion. How do we make it better?
Yeah, and I don't argue with Joe about some of this. And I've been a part of, I designed a whole training in Chicago for all the districts around some of this, and in terms of how to address it. And I can tell you this, the institution is just incredibly resistant to things like anti-racist training, right? And also redoing, some of their practices, which leads itself to even how we can get better about even just addressing the institution. I will say this. I am also the lead evaluator and researcher for a project that's been investigating a partnership between police and community around lowering crime. And, we've got some pretty good preliminary results in terms of the reduction of crime. But one of the things that was clear, and we modeled this is actually a Department of Justice funding and a model that's happening around the country, is to look at ways to really address some of those things that Joe talked about, increasing the capacity on community to partner with police around mental health and issues of mental health, increasing engagement of sites and using what we call place-based methods to work in community to create more what we call an activation of many spaces. And what we know is that so often where we see the highest crime and some of the greatest issues are also the places that are the most under-resourced, haven't been developed in terms of capacity and or haven't grown leadership to be able to address some of those issues. And when those things happen, when you increase the capacity on community folks to understand, these mental health issues and challenges of safety, when you engage police around figuring out different ways of both reducing harm, reducing their impact, and their willingness to use violence and aggressive means to address even mental health crisis, you see better results, right? And so how do we continue to support efforts like that, whether that's in Chicago or in Bryan or any place else in the country?
Thank you. Thank you both. I have a comment here to mention as a resource, My Grandmother's Hands by Resma Minichin, who talks about building compassion and policing systemic training. So that was a comment from one of our participants. Also, we have a question about, I know you both have shared quite a few resources with our audience. If there are any additional resources that you would like to share, we have shared in the chat, someone has shared learningforjustice.org has been shared for educational resources that can be used in the classroom. So if you have any additional resources to share, that would be great as well.
Yeah, I'm sure Joe's got some other. That book, Resma Menakem, Menakem, My Grandmother's Hands, a great book, great resource.
Now, Professor Harden, what kind of work did you do in Chicago? I see you were working on talking about torture by the police in Chicago. Could you tell us a little bit about that, some of the history about that and what was being done?
So that particular piece, Commander John Burge was a commander in one of the police districts in Chicago. And through the course of probably a decade and a half, and he was also a Vietnam soldier, commander, as well. And then when he came home, joined the police department, eventually worked his way up in the police department. What has been documented, he began to use many of the techniques of torture that he learned in Nam on citizens of Chicago, predominantly Black men, but also some Latino and men and women. and tortured them into false confessions, including, bags over their heads, harming their genitalia, and some of the classic techniques, torture techniques we see, and a lot of it was racialized as well. And many of the men ended up serving 2 decades or more in prison behind their false confessions. And so in roughly 8 years ago now, the City of Chicago Council awarded, after years of fighting and struggle, the first of its kind of reparations ordinance, basically for 50 of the men who were tortured and served significant time in prison, where they received reparations from the City of Chicago, where they were each giving $100,000, free college, city of college education, and access to resources, as well as the development of a community mental health center that would help them deal with their harm, but also the harm of others who had been impacted by the police. And particularly, this is important because when an institution like the police, again, are meant to harm, serve and protect, not to harm, right? And so when police officers harm in that way, they betray the public trust, right? And disrupt the very fabric of community. And there's an entire system, as Joe talked about, as others talked about, that really backs them up when they create that harm, and we see that time and time again. Even our movies reflect that. How many movies have we seen where there's a good cop, bad cop, right? And then the bad cop gets away because the entire system, supports them. So it's never just about the one lone cop. It's actually that entire system that supports them. And so it became very critical for us to be able to create a supportive system for those who have been harmed, and those continue to be harmed. And so that's really what the Chicago Torture Justice Center has done. So one big piece of that was the reparations ordinance that occurred because, as some people know, the idea of reparations has been talked about, debated, and even has gone up to being explored, in Congress because of what's happened with the passage with slavery, right? And as well as to other groups in this country, including Native Americans. And so we have to explore and engage. How do we heal harm, right? That's happened. And one way is to repair it is through economic accountability, as well as creating other systems to support and heal folks through it. So that's the extent of that work. So I'm still the board president. I'm actually moved out of that position because I'm in Texas now, but still supportive of the work that's happening there.
Right. One final question for Professor Feagin. What do you think has happened to the GOP party? Is what's happening with all the white supremacist and racist viewpoints, is that due to a small number of people who are frightened, who are afraid, or is it really a reflection of the United States as a whole?
Well, it's some of both of that, and there are other factors too. In 2012, I did a book called White Party, White Government. That's a whole book addressed to that question. When I was growing up, the Republican Party was diverse enough, including with white moderates and liberals who voted for the Civil Rights Acts. And without them, our 3 major civil rights acts wouldn't have been passed. Somewhere around the Goldwater campaign and Richard Nixon's move to a white Southern strategy. It's called the Southern strategy, but it's really a white Southern strategy. because if 20, 30% of the South that was black was not part of that strategy. Anyway, the Republican Party, since the Nixon election and the Nixon campaign, which in response to the desegregation of the country, started shifting to the whites who were angry about the civil rights movements, the civil rights acts, and the shift toward a desegregated society, and started recruiting whites into the Republican Party who did not like the civil rights changes. And that has increased over time. It used to be the Democratic Party when I was growing up that was overwhelmingly racist and rooted in the South. But the parties have shifted so that the Republican Party in the South now is almost extremely heavily white, and across the country pretty heavily white. And I think the reasons for it is the question certainly suggests one of them is white fear of racial change. And that's been true since the desegregation of the 1960s. Whites are fearful of racial, maybe 60, 70% of whites are very fearful of racial change. There's the other 30 to 40%, relatively younger, I think, that's more oriented to liking the change or at least supporting it or being willing to listen to the idea of a much more diverse American democracy. So part of it is white fear of change. And you get it in some of the language that has kind of gone general in this country. White organizations of various kinds are talking about we shall not be replaced. It's called the Great Replacement Theory. That used to be way over on the extreme fringe. But we saw people marching in Charlottesville, Virginia, for example. And we see it online in various, usually pretty conservative white groups talking about we will not be replaced. I've got a bulletin for them. The white population, according to the census, just had its first decline since 1790. You better get on with the program. It's going to be a much more diverse country, no matter what you do. You can make it harder. You can make it tougher. You can make it more violent. You can try to stop these changes. But I think that the answer to the question, part of the white population, and unfortunately it looks like a majority, is committed to a Republican Party that should start repressing and suppressing voters of color to slow down this change to a multiracial democracy as much as we can. And it got violent in the insurrection on January 6th. I never thought I would see an attack on the Capitol building by whites with Confederate flags and Trump banners, many of them yelling this kind of great replacement language. And angry, right? So I think part of it is that white anger over racial change. And we better do something about that soon. I was reading at the bookstore yesterday, part of Mary Trump has a new book called The Reckoning, or just Reckoning. I highly recommend it. Somehow she got her hands on a lot of critical race theory. She's like a psychotherapist or a clinical psychologist, but she started reading systemic racism and critical race theory and looking at her uncle, Donald Trump, through that lens, it's a pretty depressing book. She comes out at the end unsure whether this country can survive this radical white supremacist turn in the Republican Party. She just says up front, I heard her on what? MSNBC, white supremacy is our political problem. Now, she's not trained in social science, she's not a critical race theorist. But yeah, I think the answer to that is partially yes. It's a lot of whites who are worried about these racial changes. And they're tilted toward the oldest generations. The hope, I think, is in the younger white generations, millennials, Gen Z. A lot of them were in those protests last summer over Black Lives Matter. There were older whites there too, but the whites there, I think, are heavily shifted toward the younger part of the white population.
Well, it looks like we're going to...
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
There are other factors too, but I think this white fear of racial change has to be dealt with. It's destroying the country.
I think we're going to be cut off in 2 minutes. Professor Harden, did you want to say anything else about that? And in case we do get cut off, I'd like to thank you very, very much for both of you giving us such a great presentation, and also for everyone who showed up. So thank you very much. And Professor Harden?
I'll just say real quick what Joe said. I think dealing with that fear, right, is going to be critical. The reality is that the way to move forward is in a multiracial, aligned society. That's who we are as a country, if we really take an honest look at it. And our ability to understand and work with each other is just mission critical at this point. What I heard, I have another colleague who shared once that there's really two kind of white folks right now. One that is in that mode that Joe talked about of being afraid, and others who I would argue probably make up the majority of this call that are looking to align, to figure out, to support, to hold themselves in account as well as others in account to address a different way of being. And I think that's the hope here, is that those of us who can be allied together, that we roll up our sleeves and unpack and figure out, what are the next steps? How do we take this conversation that we had today and then begin the process of moving and creating the equitable world and society that we want to see? And that's where the hard work is. These kind of conversations, pushing back against the efforts and the around CRT, cool. But what is it going to be the roll up our sleeves work? And I think it starts in some of these conversations, but also moves into our collective actions. And, sign me up for the fight.
Okay, thank you all. And hopefully we can come up with a plan that will bring this conversation more to the people, at least in this area. Well, thank you very much, everyone. If you'd like to send any messages to us, you can send them to admin, ADMIN at brazos-uu.org. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Pam, and your group too for doing this. I think Toy and I agree on that.
Okay.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you, Crystal. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Much respect.
Bye-bye.